Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by taking up this article from the front page of the Delhi edition. The Union Finance Minister has announced an economic stimulus to help revive growth in the Indian economy, which has been hit by the second wave of the pandemic. The government has pegged the total value of this package at a massive 6.28 lakh crore rupees. This stimulus is primarily focused on the healthcare sector and as well as on pandemic hit sectors such as tourism, exports, etc. In the healthcare sector, the government is looking to extend credit guarantee facilities to the range of 50,000 crore rupees for supporting the creation of adequate healthcare facilities and infrastructure outside of metro cities. The interest rate for these loans shall be capped at 7.95%, along with an additional investment of 15,000 crore rupees from the government for public healthcare projects to augment and strengthen healthcare infrastructure, especially pediatric care for children, along with revamping essential healthcare facilities such as ICU beds, oxygen supplies, etc. Then, for pandemic hit sectors of the economy, the government is providing loan guarantees and concessional credit, and this includes the extension of the existing emergency credit line guarantee scheme by 1.5 lakh crore rupees, along with a 60,000 crore loan guarantees and concessional credit for few select sectors. The government is also launching a scheme for small borrowers, and around 25 lakh small borrowers would be eligible to get cheap loans worth around 7,500 crore rupees through microfinance institutions. The package also provides for dedicated loan facilities for the tourism sector, along with concessions on Provident Fund contributions. And to help revive the tourism sector, the government is also introducing a 1 month free tourist visa for first 5 lakh foreigners in order to give a boost to the hospitality sector, which has been severely hit by the pandemic. The finance minister has stated that this stimulus package is intended to trigger growth in the economy and help in the creation of jobs along with promoting Indian exports. While the government has pegged the total value of this package at 6.28 lakh crore rupees, economic experts have pointed out that this package includes several existing schemes as well. And if you were to exclude those existing schemes, then the fresh stimulus being injected stands at around just 60,000 crore rupees through this latest announcement. Economists are of the opinion that this package won't be sufficient to help the pandemic hit economy. And while some of the investments and new schemes are appreciable, it won't be sufficient to revive GDP growth and exports. And if the government is seeking to stimulate job creation, then it will have to come out with a much larger direct stimulus that will help infuse fresh capital to the pandemic hit sectors. But the investments announced by the government and the loan guarantees announced for the healthcare sector is really appreciable, as it will help the healthcare sector to scale up its infrastructure in preparation for a possible third wave of the pandemic. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the writer critically examines the aggressive privatization policy that is being pursued by the government of India. See, privatization refers to the divesting or disinvesting of government shareholding in public sector units or public sector enterprises. Post independence, the government of India envisioned the PSUs as the workhorses of the economy, and as envisioned, they helped a newly independent country to become independent and self reliant in several sectors. The PSUs did serve a key purpose in supporting the economy and in driving India's growth and prosperity. But however, inefficiencies crept in into the functioning and operations of these PSUs as a result of socialist era policies. And by 1980s, 1990s, many of these PSUs started becoming a burden on the government. By this time, the global thinking on public enterprises was also changing as a result of the Washington Consensus, which is basically a set of 10 economic policy prescriptions considered to constitute the standard reforms package for developing countries which are facing economic crisis, and is promoted by institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the United States. The Washington Consensus is based on free market economy, and it seeks to promote the goals of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. By early 1990s, the thinking in public administration was that the government has no role to be in business, and it became an accepted paradigm that what we need is a minimum government that only plays the role of an enabler or a catalyst or a regulator while leaving the domain of business to private enterprises. In line with this thinking, India introduced the LPG reforms in the backdrop of its economic crisis. And since then, India has been traversing the path of privatization, seeking to disinvest its loss making public sector units. Such disinvestments raises revenue for the government as well, and at the same time, it also helps in reviving some of the sick PSUs or in reducing the burden on the government by entirely selling off or closing some of the public sector units. This privatization policy has been pursued by successive governments, and back in the early 2000s, the NDA did carry out some privatization in a few companies, but eventually it had to be put on hold due to a political backlash. Because privatization always triggers a political controversy, as the employees of these public sector units, who are set to lose their jobs, their rights, and privileges, raise the question of labor rights, and eventually this turns into a political controversy, as the labor unions and the laborers represent an important political constituency. So, as a result of this political backlash, the UPA government didn't make much progress with regard to privatization, and even the current Modi government in the initial term did not seek to prioritize privatization. But in the last few years, the government has adopted an aggressive privatization policy, which the writer compares to the privatization era in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. Privatization, through disinvestment of government shareholding in PSUs, not only generates revenue to the government, but also helps in reforming and also in possibly reviving some of the sick PSUs by bringing in the best practices from the private sector. The private sector, which is driven by the profit motive, is always considered to be more efficient, and it can bring in the necessary managerial practices and the best human resources and as well as technology, which could help revive the sick and underperforming PSUs. The complete sale or closure of some PSUs will also help in reducing the financial burden on the government, and it is seen to be a financially prudent policy. But however, privatization also comes with risks, and it raises a lot of concerns, because if the privatization policy is not well balanced, it could severely affect labor rights, and it could compromise the livelihoods of millions of families which are dependent on public sector units. And it could also take away the key control that the government exercises in the economy, especially through its control of key public sector units. So the writer, while he supports the ongoing privatization drive being undertaken by the Modi government, he does call upon the government to exercise more caution and adopt a more prudent policy by carefully considering the pros and cons of privatization. The writer suggests that instead of going for outright privatization of almost all PSUs, it would be much more prudent to divide the PSUs into three categories. The first category should include the sick, outdated, and obsolete PSUs, which are beyond any revival or redemption. These are the public sector units where their technology, their plants, and machinery have become completely outdated, and their managerial and human resources simply cannot compete in the current economic context. So, such PSUs, which are beyond revival, they need to be closed down entirely. And following this immediate closure, its assets could be liquidated in order to generate precious revenue to the government, part of which could be used to provide a golden handshake to its employees. Golden handshake refers to the compensation or the severance package that a company provides to its employees when they lose their jobs. Several sick and outdated PSUs, they are sitting on a lot of assets, especially land and even machinery. While most of the machinery will go into scrap, land is a very precious asset which has to be carefully liquidated with the right methodology so that maximum revenue can be raised for the government and a part of it could be used to compensate the employees whose livelihoods are getting disrupted through privatization. He says that such PSUs should be brought out of the ministries that they currently operate under and they should be placed under a holding company which is set up exclusively for this purpose. The only job of this holding company should be to help liquidate the assets of outdated PSUs and enable their complete closure. The second category of PSUs are the ones which are financially sick, but they do hold a lot of promise for any potential revival and turnaround. In case of such PSUs, the government can look at partial disinvestment or maybe even complete disinvestment by working closely with strategic private partners. Companies like Air India and ITDC come to mind, and these are some of the PSUs that have the potential to be revived by bringing in private investments and by bringing in the best practices from the private sector. Then finally, we have the profitable PSUs, which the government should never sell, and instead the government should retain them and nurture them and ensure that these PSUs become significant players in the global economy. This is where the writer suggests that India should be drawing lessons from the Chinese model of privatization. China, despite being a communist country, has adopted a mix of capitalism and socialism, and today it has not only nurtured some of its public sector enterprises, but it has also encouraged several private enterprises. Today, 124 Chinese companies are present on the Fortune 500 list. Out of these Chinese companies, 91 of them are public sector units. Today, if China is able to dominate the global economy, it is because it has nurtured the right kind of public enterprises along with supporting private enterprises. Most of the dominant Chinese companies are public sector companies, and this model shows how one can leverage the best of both the worlds to create global companies. So the writer calls for a calibrated disinvestment strategy instead of a blind aggressive strategy, and instead of mindlessly pursuing outright privatization of all PSUs. He says that such a calibrated disinvestment will help address all key concerns. It provides an opportunity to introduce reforms in PSUs which are profitable to make them more efficient, and the government can look at introducing governance reforms, including providing more autonomy to the management and providing more flexible and extended tenures to senior management. It will also help the government to balance the needs of privatization with the protection of labor rights, while ensuring that the government retains control over key sectors and strategic areas. Just look at how India leveraged its PSUs during the pandemic. The government could immediately press into service many PSUs to help out the government's efforts during the pandemic, which simply could not have been possible with the private sector. From producing PPE kits and masks to manufacturing ventilators, several government PSUs were pressed into task. And moreover, large profit-making public enterprises will always play a key role in triggering growth and in promoting job creation in the economy. And if the government is blindly pursuing outright privatization of all companies, it will simply drain private investment into unnecessary and wasteful sectors, which instead could be used to drive up private investment in both greenfield and brownfield projects. That is, the same private investment could be used to finance new projects instead of attempting to revive old PSUs. The writer points out that today the government is blindly pursuing privatization merely to reduce its fiscal deficit in order to obtain better rating from credit rating agencies. This strategy of the government should stop because in correct accounting practice, revenue from disinvestment cannot be treated as revenue income. That is, revenue arising out of asset sales should not be classified as revenue income while computing the fiscal deficit of the country. So instead of being blindly driven by its need to bring down the fiscal deficit, the government should be focused on the larger goal of implementing calibrated disinvestment in order to create maximum value for the assets that are being liquidated, while promoting and nurturing profitable PSUs, which also helps the government retain control over several key sectors. Now let's look at a column from page number 7, in which the writer explores as to what lessons we can draw from our fight against HIV/AIDS to help us in our current fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Essentially, she's trying to explore as to how our fight against chronic epidemics can help us in containing the current pandemic. See, HIV/AIDS emerged as a global pandemic in the 1980s, and today it has become a chronic epidemic around the world. India, in particular, has a long history of dealing with this chronic epidemic, and there are several lessons that we can draw from our fight against HIV/AIDS, which can be inculcated in our fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. This field of study is known as clioepidemiology. Under this field, epidemiologists they study the information related to past epidemics in order to help in our fight against present and future epidemics. After the first case of HIV infection was detected in India in 1986, India put in place a structured and long drawn out response plan, which eventually started showing results from the late 1990s. Based on data, the writer says that from 1997 till 2010, India started registering a major success in containing the AIDS epidemic, and she tries to examine the model that helped in this successful fight against AIDS. First and foremost, a national level strategy was designed with complete backing of the center, including political support and financial support. The National AIDS Control Organization was established, and since 1992, it became the epicenter of India's fight against HIV/AIDS. Through the NACO, an integrated action plan was worked out directly under its supervision, with complete political and financial support of the center, and the states and the union territories were given the flexibility to come out with their own models, which was in line with the integrated action plan. Under the National AIDS Control Program, every state and union territory they established their own AIDS control organizations, and they were given complete flexibility to implement their strategies, which would be in line with the integrated action plan being implemented by the center through the NACO. Under this strategy, aggressive and widespread testing was promoted by establishing a strong network of healthcare professionals and volunteers. The responsible institutions reached out to every nook and corner of the country to focus on early detection because early diagnosis in the case of HIV/AIDS gives those with a compromised immune system a fighting chance because early treatment could be started, thereby saving precious lives. Along with this focus on diagnostics and treatment, parallelly, the AIDS control program focused on promoting awareness and education in order to introduce behavioral and attitudinal changes amongst the public. Especially, the high risk groups were identified and they became the focus of these awareness and education campaigns. Through these awareness and educational initiatives, the government reached out to gay community, the transgenders, sex workers, truck drivers, and drug addicts to promote the importance of safe sex practices. Sex education was widely promoted in schools and colleges as well, along with adequate measures to contain transmission through blood transfusion and as well as to cut the possible transmission from a mother to a child. These parallel simultaneous strategies helped India achieve tremendous success in its fight against AIDS during this period. But alarmingly, India has been falling behind of late. See, under the National AIDS Control Program, India had set itself a target of ensuring that at least 90% of the patients should be put on ART therapy or antiretroviral therapy by 2020. But post 2010, the government strategy against AIDS has been losing focus, and as a result, India is likely to miss this target by a good 5 years. Under the National Health Policy of 2017, and as well as under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the target to end AIDS or eliminate AIDS has been set for 2030. Going by the current numbers, India is unlikely to achieve this target as well, because in the last 6 to 7 years, India has reported a significant reduction in the diagnosis rate as a result of reduction in testing, and this has been accompanied with a parallel rise in the number of cases and the number of deaths. And these alarming statistics coincide with the decreasing focus of the government on awareness and educational campaigns. So, this experience from our fight against AIDS clearly shows as to where India succeeded and where India went wrong. These lessons are valuable, which can be easily incorporated in our fight against the COVID 19 pandemic as well. Our fight against AIDS clearly showed that we can't deal with epidemics and pandemics just by looking at it as a healthcare problem. These healthcare related disasters can have a much wider impact as they completely disrupt socio-economic welfare in the country. And hence, it's very, very important to take a long term view and a holistic view while designing a counter strategy to contain these epidemics and pandemics. Despite having these lessons readily available, the government of India currently is excessively focused on COVID 19 from a short term perspective, and it is largely treating it as a healthcare disaster. So it's very important to shift the strategy to take a more long term view and be ready to fight this disease for years together by focusing on the socio-economic sector as well. This would require a multi-pronged, multi-sectoral approach involving multiple institutions and multiple professionals who solely rely on quality data, established science and evidence to make the right kind of decisions and to provide the right kind of advice to the government. But unfortunately, in our fight against the pandemic, we have seen the quality of data to be suffering, along with rapid reduction in testing, especially when the waves subside. The undercounting of cases and deaths clearly illustrates the poor data that is being collected, and also the several controversial unscientific treatment techniques being promoted raises questions over the government strategy. One major lesson we have learned from our fight against AIDS is that to fight epidemics and pandemics, you need a strong surveillance network. Such a network has already been established in the form of ICTC, or the Integrated Counseling and Testing Centers, to help us fight against AIDS. This infrastructure could be readily used if we repurpose the ICTC to strengthen our surveillance network against COVID 19 as well. So, these key lessons can be drawn only if we keep those conversations alive regarding the lessons that India has learned by fighting HIV/AIDS. Now, let's look at a column from page number 7 in which the writers evaluate India's failure to honor adverse international judicial rulings with regard to corporate taxation and corporate dealings, which has hurt India's image as a credible and trustworthy investment destination. See, while the government actively promotes the Make in India initiative, and as it tries to attract more investments into India as an attractive investment destination, it relies upon India's credibility and India's credentials as an attractive investment destination. Foreign investors often invest in other countries by looking at the country's infrastructure, the policies of its government, the depth and reach of its market, and more importantly, the ability of that government and the courts of that country to enforce the awards and honor the contracts. Just like investors are driven away if there is poor infrastructure and poor government policies, similarly, if the government and the courts, if they fail to honor contracts and enforce awards, investors are shaken and they often tend to move away from such destinations. This argument has come up in the context of two cases that India has lost through international arbitration related to corporate taxation. Last year, India lost two major bilateral investment treaty related disputes, which concerned two major companies. One was Vodafone and the other was Kane Energy. Both these companies had entered into a legal dispute with India on the question of retrospective taxation. These problems began with the UPA government, which during its second term came out with a very controversial amendment to tax laws. See, the generally accepted norm in taxation laws and even in criminal laws is that there won't be any retrospective changes. For example, a person can be punished only for those offenses which exist when the crime was committed. You can't make a retrospective change to criminal laws and seek punishment retrospectively. Similarly, taxation is based on current laws that exist, and retrospective changes are not encouraged and they are seen to be regressive. Because investors come to invest in the country only when they clearly know what is the tax liability. But a few years ago, the UPA government, during its second term, introduced a controversial change in the taxation laws that provided for retrospective taxation. This change was brought in to bring the offshore profits of some of these companies under Indian taxation to realize more government revenue. But since it was a retrospective change, these companies challenged India's decision to impose retrospective taxes on them. Eventually, they took the route of international arbitration, and last year, India lost both the cases as expected. Then there are similar legal disputes and battles that India is involved in with regard to bilateral investment treaties, where several companies have been affected by India's regressive policies. Yes, the government has every right to take legal action against those companies which are not obeying the law of the land. But at the same time, the government should also have the humility to accept and as well as enforce and implement any rulings and awards which might have gone against it as well. So, after losing the arbitration cases, instead of accepting the award and fulfilling the commitments, India has legally challenged these awards obtained by these companies through international arbitration, and this severely affects India's credibility as a stable investment destination. Foreign investors who look at India's resistance to accept international judicial rulings, they would be driven away as they would raise doubts over India's credentials as a trustworthy investment destination. So the writers call for a course correction in such genuine cases and call upon the government to accept such international judicial rulings and enforce them so that it can protect its image as a stable investment destination. Then on page number 6, we have a couple of articles related to sedition, which has been provided under section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. This editorial and column examine the controversy surrounding the misuse of sedition laws, and for a detailed understanding of this topic, please go and watch one of our explained videos which has covered the topic in complete detail. The link for the same video shall be shared in the description box below, so watch the analysis once and then you can go through these articles. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: critically examine India's policy of aggressive privatization of public enterprises. The second question: does our fight against chronic epidemics such as HIV/AIDS offer any lessons to curb the COVID-19 pandemic? Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.